How is the sound? And visibility of the screen? Okay. If anybody has any trouble seeing from the back, maybe it's better to come up to the front. Change seats with younger people with sharp vision. Yeah, I know. Okay, so we stand and we'll begin with three half bows to the Buddha.
First bow, second bow, third bow. A bow to Pandit.
Okay. Okay.
Please sit.
Okay, so this is Friday evening, August 30th. And I'll begin with reciting 3 times the line of homage to the Buddha. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Okay, good evening, everybody, and welcome to, this is the Abhidhamma retreat, the beginning of the Abhidhamma retreat for 2019. And just to sort of fill you in on the background of sort of where we are in our study of the Abhidhamma, starting in the year 2013 and over the next, I think, 14, 15, 16, the next 4 years, we held Abhidhamma retreats here based on the comprehensive manual of Abhidhamma, the Abhidhammatta Sangaha. And so over the 4 years, we covered at least the principle, the main parts of that volume, which gives a very broad overview of the Abhidharma, the entire Theravada Abhidharma system. Then, in 2017, I started a new series of Abhidhamma retreats based on the middle chapters in the Visuddhimagga, which is translated as the path of purification. So these middle chapters are rooted in the Abhidhamma, and also they give a broad overview, a rather technical and very detailed overview of the Abhidharma system. So in 2017, I did chapter 14, which is on the 5 aggregates. Last year, 2018, I did chapters 15 and 16, which cover the 12 sense bases, the 18 elements, the faculties, and the 4 noble truths. And this year, we come to chapter 17 of the Visuddhimagga, which is on dependent origination, paticca samuppada. And this is a very, very difficult chapter. I don't know how many people here tried to read it on your own. When I was reading it and I was thinking, how is anybody going to understand this? Because it's written in a very, very technical, very detailed, very scholastic style. And so often when I read the translation to find out what the translation is saying, I have to look at the Pali. So I could well understand if anybody here, I know some people told me that they tried to read it and after a few pages gave up. But I put a warning with the notice about this Abhidhamma retreat. I said, don't try to read chapter 17 on your own because you'll get discouraged and maybe you'll cancel your registration. But what I've done is to go through this chapter, and I've highlighted the more important parts, and I think hopefully I've extracted the essence of it and compressed it into a few pages of summary, which I had sent out yesterday. I hope everybody got those. I think it's about 5 additional pages called Dependent Origination and Conditional Relations. Okay, so that takes us to where we are today. And in this retreat, I'm going to be presenting dependent origination from 2 complementary perspectives. One is the perspective of the suttas, which I've made a selection of suttas on dependent origination, which we will be I don't need that. Yeah, okay, that's better. Okay, so I made a selection of suttas, which was put up on the website, so you should have that selection of suttas, which highlights dependent origination from different perspectives according to the sutta method of analysis. And then we will be taking dependent origination from the perspective of the Abhidharma, the distinctive perspective of the Abhidharma. But to prepare to see and to understand dependent origination from the Abhidhamma perspective, first, okay, so tomorrow we do Abhidhamma from the Sutta perspective. Tomorrow's Saturday. Monday, I deal with Abhidhamma, with dependent origination from the Abhidhamma perspective. And so to prepare to understand Abhidhamma to prepare for understanding dependent origination from the Abhidhamma perspective, first, on Sunday, what I have to do is give a broad summary of the analysis of states of consciousness in the Abhidhamma. And then in the afternoon, deal with a special topic called the 24 conditional relations, which is the tool that the Visuddhimagga and the Theravada tradition uses to explain the links of dependent origination. If this sounds obscure to you now, don't worry. As we go along, I think you'll come to understand it. Okay, but in today's presentation, what I want to do is to emphasize or to deal with the importance of dependent origination in the Buddha's teaching, and that includes some broad general comments about dependent origination. Okay, so to get some idea of the importance of dependent origination, I started off with a quotation by the Venerable Sariputta, who is the Buddha's foremost disciple in regard to wisdom. Sariputta quotes the Buddha as saying, "One who sees dependent origination sees the Dhamma. Yo paticca samuppadang passati, so dhammang passati. Yo dhammang passati, so paticca samuppadang passati." One who sees dependent origination sees the Dhamma. One who sees the Dhamma sees dependent origination. And so our task as followers and practitioners of the Buddha Dhamma, when we ask, like, what are all of the teachings driving at eventually? All of the preparatory teachings, all of the teachings that come within the domain of panya, or wisdom, they're all sort of guiding us and directing us to see dependent origination, to see the origination of phenomena dependent on conditions. And so we can say that this is the sterling discovery of the Buddha and the sterling proclamation of the Buddha, a teaching that distinguishes the Buddha Dharma from all the contemporary teachings of India in the Buddha's time, and probably from all religious and spiritual teachings through the centuries up to the present time. There's also a sutta called the Maha Nidana Sutta, the great discourse on causation, in which the Buddha's personal attendant, Ananda, comes to the Buddha and he says to the Buddha that it's wonderful and marvelous how this dependent origination is so deep and appears so deep that he says, to me, it seems as clear and as simple as can be. And then the Buddha reproaches Ananda and he says, do not say so, Ananda, do not say so. This dependent origination is deep and it appears deep. And then he makes very, very incisive statement. He says, it's because of not understanding and not penetrating this Dhamma, this teaching of dependent origination, that this generation, this population of human beings and deities and other sentient beings has become like a tangled skein, like a knotted ball of threaded, like matted rushes and reeds, and cannot pass beyond, cannot escape from this samsara, this beginningless round of birth and death with its plane of misery, the bad destinations, the lower realms. And so this statement shows us very concisely two things that we have to do with regard to dependent origination in order to gain this liberation. The two are indicated by the words here translated as understanding and penetration. Pali words are anubodha and pativeda. So anubodha, of course, you can see here the base of the word is bodha, which actually is the same word that's used for enlightenment. But here it's not the full enlightenment, but anu means along with. So this is a kind of understanding that accords with the understanding that comes through enlightenment. So it's a conceptual or intellectual understanding of dependent origination, or a preparatory understanding that comes through the development of the initial stages of insight meditation. And then when the insight into dependent origination reaches its culmination, then it results in pativeda. Pativeda, it's from the base of the word is ved, which comes from a root meaning to pierce. And pati maybe gives a sense of through. So this is piercing through dependent origination. That is seeing it directly and visibly, or even viscerally, seeing it with deep personal understanding, penetrative understanding. So anubodha, we could say, is in technical terms, it's the lokia or mundane understanding of dependent origination, understanding it with the preparatory wisdom, which is still connected to the world. And pativeda is the lokuttara, world-transcending understanding or liberating wisdom. And so to gain the goal of the Buddha's teaching, Generally, we need both. I see generally because there are a few people, like Sariputta, for example, as we'll see, who didn't have to go through it. At least it seems he didn't have to go through an intellectual preparatory understanding. But as soon as he heard dependent origination, immediately he gained that liberating realization. But for putting aside those few exceptional individuals, most of us, almost all of us, have to go through these two stages of preparing the way with mundane understanding, through study, reflection, and the earlier stages of insight. And when we've prepared the way through those preparatory stages, then when our faculties are ripe, there comes the world-transcending breakthrough of penetration to dependent origination. Okay, so what the usual formula for dependent origination, as we'll see, lays out a sequence of 12 factors, and those 12 factors are bound together in pairs of conditioning relationships of conditioning state and conditioned state. And what the formula, taken through a broad overview, what it lays out is the sequence of conditions that keep us in bondage, as the Buddha says, to this samsara with its plane of misery, bad destinations, and lower realms. And so we study dependent origination and then practice insight to try to gain realization of dependent origination in order to unravel, disentangle that chain of conditions. It's as if we were sort of bound up, somebody had tied up our arms, our legs, everything is bound up so that we can't move. So we don't realize that that's our ordinary condition, our samsara condition. But if we manage sort of to wiggle, even our fingers are bound, tied up, the wrists, the ankles, everything is bound up. But if we manage to wiggle a few fingers free, then we want to get free from this rope that's tying us up and down, inside and out. So what we have to do is to figure out how that rope has been tied. If we just go on struggling with the rope without seeing how it's tied, we're just going to go on struggling and exhausting ourselves for hours until our captor comes back and reties the rope. So what we have to do is to figure out how the rope has been tied. Then we have to use our free fingers to start picking away at the knots in that rope till at least we get some knots loose. Then we can get a hand loose, another hand loose, and then start disentangling the other knots. Then we could walk out and we're free. Okay, so this is why we study dependent origination, to see how the knots are tied that keep us in bondage. And then we use our understanding and we use the guidelines of the Buddha's teaching to disentangle those knots, to go back to the most fundamental knots, disentangle them, and then we break free and we are beyond the bondage of samsara with its plane of misery and lower realms. Okay, dependent origination is sometimes presented as the key to the Buddha's own enlightenment. And so to understand the function of dependent origination, first we have to go back to the Buddha's account of his own quest for enlightenment. And we find this maybe stated most fully, most explicitly in the Majjhima Nikaya, the middle-length discourses, in Sutta number 26, called the Arya Pariyesana Sutta. So this is the discourse on the noble quest. And here the Buddha speaks about, he says, before my enlightenment, while I was only an unenlightened bodhisattva, I was subject myself to birth, and I saw things subject to birth, being myself subject to old age, sickness, death, sorrow, and defilement. I saw it while was also subject to old age, sickness, death, sorrow, and defilement. Okay, then I reflected, being myself subject to birth, why do I seek what is subject to birth? Being subject to old age, sickness, death, sorrow, and so on. Why do I seek things subject to these things? Suppose that being myself subject to birth, having understood the danger in what is subject to birth, I should seek the unborn supreme security from bondage, nibbana, which is not subject to birth, which is unaging, free from sickness, free from death, sorrowless, undefiled, the supreme security from bondage, nibbana. So that was what motivated the Buddha's quest and sort of sent him out on his path of renunciation. So in quest of that which is unborn, unaging, without sickness, the deathless, he gave up his life of luxury, became a wandering ascetic, practiced the austerities and meditations for 6 years, until sitting under the Bodhi tree, he attained the 4 jhanas, the meditative absorptions, and then after emerging from those meditative absorptions, then he began that investigation that will lead to his full supreme enlightenment. And that investigation occurs as an investigation into dependent origination. Okay, so this is a sutta which shows the Buddha undertaking the investigations which lead to his realization, of enlightenment. And here we could see that the Buddha is, let's say, he's taking a wider perspective. Now he's not thinking only of himself as being subject to birth, old age, and death, but he's expanding the range of his reflection to take into account the whole world. So he considers that this world has fallen into trouble, into misery, in that it is born, people are born, they grow old, they die, then they pass away, and they take rebirth elsewhere. But they do not understand the escape from this dukkha, from this suffering, which is sort of symbolized most poignantly by jara maranang, old age and death. And then he ponders the question, when will an escape be discovered from the suffering of old age and death. So he's now facing the problem of bondage to old age and death, and seeking the escape from it, liberation from it. And in order to find the way to liberation, he proceeds by looking into the conditions that maintain old age and death. So we could see here, even though at this point the Buddha doesn't have the expression in his mind, dependent origination, but he's using the principle of conditionality to investigate the underlying situation of bondage, using the principle of conditionality in order to trace the chain of conditions that keep one in bondage. And so by tracing the chain of conditions, he can come back to the most fundamental roots of his bondage. And so he does this by asking, when what exists does old age and death occur? By what is old age and death conditioned? And then he says that through careful attention, there took place in me a breakthrough by wisdom. When there is birth, old age and death comes to be. Old age and death is conditioned by birth. Of course, actually, it seems if we take this statement in isolation, it seems like any 3-year-old kid knows that old age and death occurs because one is born. But this is only the starting point for the investigation of the chain of conditions. And maybe it's because, the way the 5-year-old kid knows that old age and death occurs because of birth is somewhat different from the way the Bodhisattva, the future Buddha, understands that old age and death occurs because of birth. Here, it's just not taking birth as an obvious condition for old age and death, but he's seeing birth as the starting point for this whole life process. And then he's going to investigate what are the conditions for birth. And the important expression that occurs here, I have it in translation, but let me write the Pali out. So he uses this expression which has repeated, actually all 3 of these terms occur repeatedly throughout the Buddha's discourses. So the first is what I translate as careful attention, yoniso manasikara. The yoniso can also be taken to have the sense of thorough, methodical, and manasikara is reflection or consideration. So this is a deep, thorough, careful reflection. Out of that reflection, careful and thorough reflection or investigation, there arises panya, or Sanskrit prajna, wisdom. And so this would be probably the wisdom of insight coming out of this deep consideration, deep reflection. And then through the maturation of wisdom, when the wisdom reaches the supramundane or world-transcending level, it culminates in abhisamaya. This is translated here as breakthrough or a kind of clear realization. So in each stage here, the Buddha is going through, or in each segment of this line of reflection, the Buddha's mind is going through three stages. The stage of deep reflection, leading to panya, a direct understanding with insight. And then through the understanding with insight, there comes the breakthrough realization, the clear realization. Okay, I'm going to go through the sutta in more detail tomorrow. I just wanted to bring up this passage to show how the Buddha's reflection on the eve of his enlightenment involves an examination of dependent origination. And when he comes to the end of the sequence, going through the 11 connections, then he concludes that such is the origin of this whole mass of suffering. And then he says, or he thinks, origination, origination, or arising, arising. Thus, in regard to things unheard before, things not known before, things not being taught and transmitted in the complex Indian spiritual systems of his time, he says, there arose in me Chakung Udapadi, the vision arose, Jnanang Udapadi, knowledge arose, Panya Udapadi, wisdom arose, Vijja Udapadi, clear, true knowledge arose, Aloko Udapadi, light arose. But this discovery of the origination side of dependent origination was not the end of the process for the Buddha or the Bodhisattva. In a sense, he's only halfway there. Because now he goes through the other half of dependent origination. This is the series of cessation. So he reflects, when what does not exist, does old age and death come to an end? With the cessation of what does old age and death cease? And then he realizes, when there is no birth, old age and death does not come to be. With the cessation of birth, old age and death ceases. And then he goes down through the series till he says that such is the cessation of this whole mass of suffering. And then he thinks, cessation, cessation, again, in regard to things unheard before, there arose in me vision, knowledge, wisdom, true knowledge, and light. Okay, there's an interesting passage in the commentary to the Mahanidana Sutta. So this is commentarial. It's not direct Buddha word, but it's a way of underscoring the importance of dependent origination from the standpoint of the commentators. And so they're putting these words in the Buddha's mouth. And this is the Buddha here, he's replying to Ananda's statement in the Mahanidana Sutta, in the Great Discourse on Causation. Ananda had said that even though this dependent origination is said to be deep and deep in appearance, but to me it seems as clear as can be. Then the Buddha says, do not say so, Ananda, do not say so, Ananda. And then the commentary is elaborating on this, and it's depicting the Buddha saying to Ananda, didn't I spend 4 incalculable periods and 100,000 aeons, mahakalpas, striving to penetrate this principle of conditionality, dependent origination. So this is the period of time where it said the Buddha lived and practiced as a bodhisattva, striving to fulfill the paramitas. And he says, there's no gift that I did not give, no paramita that I did not fulfill to penetrate this dependent origination. Then he says that resolved upon penetrating the principle of conditionality, I dispelled the army of Mara the evil one, as though it were powerless. But even then, the earth did not move an inch. Then in the first watch of the night, I recollected my past existences. Still, the earth did not move. In the middle watch of the night, I attained the divine eye, in which I could see the workings of karma and the process of rebirth, but still the earth did not move. But in the last watch of the night, as soon as I saw ignorance is the condition for sankharas, volitional formations, and for volitional formations is the condition for consciousness and so on, then this 10,000-fold world system let loose 100 roars, 1,000 roars, and it shook like a drop of water on a lotus leaf. So deep, Ananda, is this dependent origination, and so deep its appearance. Okay, so we see here that it's the discovery of dependent origination on the night of the enlightenment that will culminate in the Buddha's attainment of the Anuttara Sammasambodhi, the unsurpassed supreme enlightenment. But that doesn't end the Buddha's examination of dependent origination. After the enlightenment, this comes in the Udana and also in the opening of the Vinaya, or the Mahavagga chapter of the Vinaya. The text describes what is occurring to the Buddha in the period after the enlightenment. So what is the Buddha doing after the enlightenment? He is again reflecting on and examining dependent origination. He doesn't have to do this now in order to find the way to liberation for himself, because now he's liberated, now he's broken his own bondage. But he's examining dependent origination, maybe in a way to see it more and more deeply, more and more clearly, and to investigate it from different angles to see different implications of dependent origination. So it's said here, this is the first sutta in the Udana, one of the small books in the miscellaneous division of the Sutta Pitaka. So it said that at one time the Buddha was staying at Uruvela at the foot of the Bodhi tree. So he's still under the tree where he attained full enlightenment. And so he sits cross-legged for 7 days, experiencing the bliss of liberation uninterrupted. Okay, then at the end of those 7 days, he emerges from this samadhi, this deep absorption, and he gives yoniso manasikara. Again, he gives this careful, thorough attention to dependent origination in forward order. This is during the first watch of the night, taking it from, with ignorance as condition, the volitional activities, volitional formations come to be. Okay, then during the middle watch of the night, he gives attention to dependent origination in reverse order, in the order of cessation. And then in the last watch of the night, he reviews dependent origination in both directions, in forward order from ignorance down to old age and death, in terms of origination, and then by way of cessation, with the cessation of ignorance, cessation of volitional formations, down to cessation of old age and death. And then at the end, actually at the end of each watch of the night, he recites a beautiful verse, but here I took only the final verse. Yada have patu bhavanti dhamma atapino jayato brahmanasa vidupayang titati marasayang suryova ubasayang antalikang. So when dhammas, phenomena, appear clearly to the ardent, meditating Brahman, he refers to himself as a Brahman, he stands dispelling the army of Mara, just like the sun illuminating the sky at dawn. It's a very beautiful verse. Okay, so now under this, at the seat of enlightenment, he's investigating dependent origination in forward order, reverse order, both forward order and reverse order. And then, after this long period of reflection and sort of maybe digesting the experience of enlightenment, exploring its different implications and ramifications, he starts to consider now, the question comes to his mind, should I teach, try to convey the Dhamma to others? Should I try to reveal this Dhamma that I've discovered to the world? And then he thinks, this Dhamma, this truth that I have discovered is profound, hard to see, hard to understand, peaceful and sublime, unattainable by mere reasoning, subtle to be experienced by the wise. So he's looking now at the Dhamma. Now, then he turns his glance out to the world, and he considers that this world of people, he sees them all maybe walking down the streets, looking at their cell phones, clicking this, clicking that, or at their shopping malls, and he thinks this population delights in attachment, takes delight in attachment, rejoices in attachment. Then he thinks it is hard for such people to see this truth, namely specific conditionality, dependent origination. And it is hard to see this truth as well, the stilling of all conditioned formations, the relinquishing of all acquisitions, all attachments, the destruction of craving, dispassion, cessation, nibbana. If I were to teach the Dhamma, others would not understand me, and that would be wearisome for me. That would be troublesome for me. And then he recites these verses, these verses occur to him, that these people excited by lust, wrapped in the darkness of delusion, will never perceive this profound Dhamma, which goes against the worldly stream, which is subtle, deep, and difficult to see. And so what is that Dhamma that the Buddha calls profound, hard to see, and which made him so reluctant to start teaching? Two aspects to that Dhamma. One aspect, you could say, is dependent origination. So one aspect is dependent origination, which is the side of the conditions that maintain the round of birth and death. And the other side is the state of liberation from birth and death, nibbana. And it's because of these two aspects of the Dhamma, these two, you call them the heads and tails of that coin of the Dhamma, that the Buddha was so reluctant to teach to the world. But then what happens, if you know the sequel to this passage, the Buddha decides, better that I just live quietly in seclusion and enjoy this peace of liberation on my own. But then Mahabrahma, or Brahma Sahampati, one of the high deities in the Brahma realm, realizes the Buddha is not going to teach, the world will remain in darkness. And so Mahabrahma vanishes from the Brahma world, comes down in front of the Buddha and says, please, Bhante, teach the Dhamma. There are those who can understand. And then the Buddha, he looks out at the world again the second time, and he sees that there are indeed people with little dust in their eyes who can understand. And then he decides to teach. And what he will teach again and again is dependent origination. So the suttas use the word that he teaches it, proclaims it, establishes it, reveals it, discloses it, opens it up, makes it manifest. They use a whole series of verbs to indicate how the Buddha teaches dependent origination. Okay, it's not only the Buddha who awakens through dependent origination, but it was also many of the disciples attain their awakening through the discourse on dependent origination. And maybe for me, the most interesting story is that of the Buddha's chief disciple with respect to wisdom. This is the Venerable Sariputta. So I'll relate the story of Sariputta. So Sariputta was a young man who came from a Brahmin family, and he had a friend from another Brahmin family living in a nearby village. The friend's name was Moggallana. And so these two young men grew up together. It was a pretty wealthy, it seems it was a well-to-do family. So they had whatever they wanted. They enjoyed things together, Sariputta, Moggallana. And one day, a hilltop festival, the villages where they lived were close to the city of Rajagaha, which at that time was the capital of the state, the large, powerful state of Magadha. So one day, a hilltop festival came to the city of Rajagaha, and it was held on a hilltop outside the city. And so it's just like nowadays when you hear that, who is it? Not the Rolling Stones concert? The Taylor Swift concert? Who are the ones? Madonna? I don't know who are the big ones nowadays. So you hear the concert is coming to Madison Square Garden or Yankee Stadium. So everybody wants to get tickets to go to the concert. So this is like the equivalent of that, or maybe the circus coming to Madison Square Garden nowadays. So Sariputta, Moggallana, they buy their tickets to go to the Hilltop Festival. So the first night they go to the festival, they're watching the different entertainments. Sometimes there are comedies. When there are comedies, they're laughing. When there are jugglers and acrobats, they're amazed at these feats, mind-boggling feats. Then maybe there'll be some dramatic performances. They're stricken with awe at the dramatic performances. And so they enjoy themselves so much that they buy tickets for the second night of the festival. They go to the festival the second night, and then as they're sitting there, Sariputta starts thinking, these actors and actresses look so beautiful and charming, and they have such skills, and the acrobats so athletic and dexterous, and skillful in all of their wonderful feats. But in 50 years, and most 100 years, they'll all be gone, all be dead. And we too, we're young men, maybe early 20s, enjoying ourselves, maybe 50 years, 100 years for certain, but even maybe tomorrow or next week, next month, we might be dead. So Sariputta is thinking this, but he doesn't want to upset his friend Moggallana, so he goes on showing himself laughing and staring with his mouth open, agape at the acrobatic feats. But then, when the festivities have finished, as they're leaving the stadium, Moggallana is very observant. So he says to Sariputta, he says, you know, I was looking at you this evening, and you didn't seem to be enjoying yourself so much. I saw you were laughing, but your laugh seemed artificial. Your amazement at the acrobatic feats didn't seem so, extraordinary as they did the first night. What were you thinking? And Sariputta said, I was thinking that everyone on the stage will be gone in 50, 70, 100 years. Will be gone. Everybody in the audience will be gone in 50, 75, 100 years. So what's the point of just enjoying these festivities? There are teachers in the forests who are struggling for a path to liberation, and there might be some who have attained liberation. So we ourselves should go seek a path to liberation. And then his friend Moggallana said, while you were thinking those thoughts, I too was thinking exactly the same thoughts. And so both of them, they went to their homes and they told their retinue of disciples, of their own sort of followers and friends, we're going to renounce the worldly life and become sannyasis, ascetics. And so their friends said, if you're going to renounce, we'll renounce too. And so all of them renounced. They gave up their regular civilian clothing and they put on the ochre robes of the sannyasis or sadhus. And Sariputta, and they start wandering and traveling around, visiting different teachers, inquiring about their teachings, never really satisfied. But at a certain point, they were staying under a teacher whose name was Sanjaya. So they were staying with that teacher. They didn't consider him enlightened, but at least they thought that we could at least live the spiritual life and we could meditate at his hermitage, and maybe we could find for ourselves the way to liberation. Okay, so one day, Sariputta went on his alms round. And so he was wandering in the village, he collected his alms, and he was sitting and he had his meal. And then he looked up and he sees a monk with shaven head and with the ochre robes walking on alms round very, very peacefully, very, very calmly, serene and self-possessed. And who is this monk? His name is Assaji, and he was one of the first 5 disciples of the Buddha, and he had already attained arahatship, the goal of the teaching. And now he was walking on alms round, And Sariputta looks up and sees him walking so calmly and self-possessed, and he's amazed. And he's just devouring this ascetic with his eyes, watching him go from house to house. And then he sees that the ascetic finishes his alms round and goes to a little grove in order to take his meal. And so Sariputta follows him to that grove and sits at a distance. He doesn't want to disturb him while he's taking his meal, but he just waits patiently. So he sits there patiently. Then when he sees that the ascetic, that this wandering ascetic has finished the meal and has cleaned his bowl, Sariputta comes up to him and says, "I've been observing you, and I saw that you were so serene, so self-possessed. Who is your teacher? What is the teaching that you follow?" And then this ascetic Asaji, this monk Asaji, says, "My name is Asaji, and I am a disciple of the son of the Sakyans, the Sakyaputta, who went forth from the Sakyan family, and now we all refer to him as the Buddha, the enlightened one." And Sariputta, when he heard the word Buddha, he was exhilarated and so happy, but he was very impatient, and so he asked, "Your teacher, the Buddha, what does he teach? Tell me his teaching." And Asaji was very, very humble, very, very simple. So he says, "I've just recently become a monk under the teaching of the Buddha." Even though he's now an arhat, you see, he became an arhat in 2 weeks. But he's quite humble, so he says, "I've just recently gone forth. I can't explain his teaching in detail." It seems also Asaji was not the type, not a very verbose type of person, but somebody who could grasp the essence, but was not a skilled, eloquent expounder of the Dhamma. And so Sariputta said, "I don't need the essence. I don't need the teaching in detail. Just tell me the essence, the core of what you've realized." And then Asaji recites a verse that over the centuries will come to be inscribed on the walls of almost every Buddhist monastery in Asia. The verse goes, "Ye Dhamma hetu pabhava, te sung hetung tatagato aha, te sanchayo nirodo evang vadi mahasamano." So the meaning, those dhammas, those things that originate from a hetu, from a cause, the Tathagata, the one who is thus come, that's a designation for the Buddha. The Tathagata describes their cause, and also that which is their cessation. Thus speaks the great ascetic. So just a 4-line stanza, Asaji recites, and as soon as Sariputta hears these 4 lines, the 4 lines you could see are just the concise statement of the principle of conditionality. Things originate from causes. The Buddha explains what are those things that originate from causes and what are the causes or conditions from which they originate. So that is the origination side of dependent origination. And then the Buddha explains how all of these phenomena cease with the cessation of their conditions. So that is what is expressed in these 4 lines of verse. And as soon as Sariputta hears this, the text says, there arose in him the stainless or dust-free, stainless eye of Dhamma. Virajang vitamalang Dhamman Dhammachakung udapadi. The stainless, dust-free eye of Dhamma arose. Whatever is subject to origination is all subject to cessation. And Sariputta, right on the spot, he attained the first stage of realization, the stage of stream entry. And then he said to Asaji, tell me, where is your teacher, the great sage, living now? And Asaji said, he's now staying in the bamboo grove outside Rajagaha. Come along with me and I'll introduce you to him. But Sariputta said, do you go along? I have a friend to bring with me. And so Asaji went back to the monastery, the bamboo grove. Actually, it's not yet even a monastery. They're still living out in the woods. Then Sariputta goes to Moggallana. And as soon as Moggallana sees Sariputta coming to him, he could just see from his expression, his manner. So he says to Sariputta, I see you've discovered the deathless. And Sariputta says, correct. Then Moggallana says, what did you learn? Sariputta tells him the verse, and as soon as Moggallana hears the verse, Moggallana also gains the stainless eye of Dhamma and becomes a stream enterer. And both of them go to the bamboo grove, and at the time they arrive, the Buddha sees them coming in the distance, and then he points out to the monks. He says, do you see those two friends coming to me? He says, those two young men, they will become my chief disciples. And then they arrive and they approach the Buddha and they say, Bhante, please let us become your disciples. And the Buddha gives them the ordination as monks. Okay, there are some other topics that I had, but I will bring those up tomorrow. Maybe I could just take, maybe if there are just a few questions of things that need clarification. I don't want to take general questions on dependent origination now, because we've really just touched the tip of the iceberg. We'll start going into the iceberg tomorrow. But anything that I said that needs some immediate clarification. Okay, I see a hand back. Is that Jane? Wow. From Pennsylvania, yeah.
Thank you. I just wanted to ask a clarification.
Yeah.
Earlier there were, I think, the two verses in the Udana 2 and 3 about how the Buddha reviewed the links of dependent origination. Did he do that after he exited samadhi, after the enlightenment, or was that during his enlightenment?
The way this is presented, this is what takes place after the enlightenment. Yeah, so it says that he spent the week enjoying or experiencing the bliss of liberation. So he's gained that liberation, he's been absorbed in it. Now he comes out and then he's reflecting and examining dependent origination. Okay, if there's no questions, then we will move over to the other side of the room and we will do a session of sitting meditation.